You know, when we think of a soldier, we usually picture the front lines, right? The battles we see in the news. But what if their toughest fights, their most draining wars, aren't against an enemy we can see? Well, today we're going to peel back the layers and look at the complex, often unseen reality of life in the Indian Army. And we're doing it through the eyes of someone who lived it.
Now, this is a quote that really makes you stop and think. It comes from our source, Major Kavish Agarwal, who used to be a JAG officer in the Army. That's a military lawyer. He says, the most helpless person in this country is the one who has a weapon in his hand. Helpless with a weapon? I mean, it sounds like a total contradiction, doesn't it? But it perfectly captures the paradox we're about to dive into. He argues that this feeling of helplessness comes from the incredible restrictions placed on using that very weapon.
Okay, so let's start with a scene that you might have actually seen yourself. Our source tells this story about being in Karol Bagh in Delhi. There's this car with an army sticker, and it's just parked smack in the middle of a super busy market road. It's causing this huge traffic jam, total chaos. The police are right there, but they don't do a thing. And the guys from the car, they just get out and wander off like it's nothing.
Now, I bet your first reaction to that is, wow, the Army can just do whatever it wants? It looks like a classic abuse of power, a clear sign that they're above the law. But what if that one image, that one anecdote, is actually hiding a much, much more complicated truth? Let's use this to tackle the first big myth.
And that right there brings us to myth number one, this idea of a soldier having absolute power. That's seen in the market, it feeds this popular narrative that the uniform gives soldiers this incredible authority over civilians, even over the police, as if they're playing by a totally different set of rules than the rest of us. But the reality on the ground, well, it's not what you think.
So get this. This slide just turns that whole idea on its head. When you ask who has more power on a regular city street, the Army or the police? Our source's answer is crystal clear: the police. In civilian areas, he argues, a soldier has basically zero power. They can't direct traffic, they can't enforce laws. The real authority, in pretty much every everyday situation, belongs to the local cop on the beat. And it's not just about interactions with the police either. Think about all the perks we imagine high-ranking government officials get. Our source points out that while ministers and bureaucrats get special quotas for things like train tickets or flights, an Army officer gets, well, nothing like that. The second they step outside the cantonment, they're just another citizen, often with way fewer practical privileges than their counterparts in the civil services. And this is where it gets really wild. Forget about civilian life for a second. Even in a combat zone, a soldier's power to act is incredibly restricted. Major Agarwal breaks down the strict Supreme Court rules a soldier has to follow before they can even fire their weapon. First, you have to be sure the person is a terrorist. Okay, but how are you supposed to do that from 200 meters away in a tense situation? Then you have to shout a warning, and if they still don't comply, the rule is to shoot them below the knee. To incapacitate, not to kill. As he puts it, this turns a split-second life-or-death decision into a bureaucratic nightmare that puts the soldier's own life in serious danger. Okay, so that leads us right into our second big myth. This notion that a soldier's life is one of freedom and choice. We celebrate their choice to serve, and we absolutely should, but we often completely miss the incredible lack of personal freedom that comes with that uniform. And I'm not just talking about being sent to a remote post. It's woven into the very contract they sign in ways that most of us would find, well, frankly, shocking. So to really get this next part, you need to know what a court-martial is. And remember, our source was a military lawyer, a JAG officer, so he knows the system inside and out. A court-martial is basically a parallel legal system just for the military. If you break military law, you don't go to a regular court, you face this one. And the stakes are unbelievably high. Punishments can go all the way up to serious prison time or even, in some cases, the death penalty.
And here's where the difference is just night and day. If a top civil servant, an IAS officer, decides they've had enough, you know what they do? They resign. The worst that happens is they're out of a job. But for an Army officer, resignation isn't a right you have. It's a request you make, and that request can be denied. If that officer decides to just leave anyway, that's called desertion. And it's a crime that can land you in prison for years. It creates this kind of bond that just doesn't exist in any other profession.
And this feeling of being trapped is made so much worse by what our source calls a lingering colonial culture inside the Army. He talks about a forced drinking culture at parties where guys who don't drink are just relentlessly pressured. He talks about seeing highly trained soldiers being used for chores like gardening at a senior officer's house.
He even shares his own story of being hit with a sword by a senior during training for asking for his own shoes back. It all points to this super rigid, old-school hierarchy where abuse can happen way too easily.
All right, on to our third and final myth for today, the idea that soldiers have this untouchable legal status. You know, the belief that the uniform is like a shield that protects them from the kind of legal drama that affects the rest of us, especially when it comes to family issues. But according to our source, the reality isn't just different, it's often the complete opposite. It leaves them incredibly vulnerable.
So just look at this number, 33%. Under the Army Act, if there's a matrimonial dispute, this is the maximum amount of a soldier's salary that can be cut right from their paycheck and given to their spouse for maintenance. That's a huge financial blow, and it's taken out before they even see their salary.
But here's the kicker. It's how this all goes down. Major Agarwal says that in a normal court, a spouse has to show proof to get maintenance. But in the Army, he claims that all it often takes is a simple letter of complaint, a letter that might not even be verified. The system, he says, is basically set up to just grant the allowance without a deep investigation. This puts the soldier in a crazy position where a mere allegation can lead to an immediate financial penalty, completely bypassing the due process everyone else is entitled to. This table really lays out what feels like a legal time warp. In India, the Supreme Court has decriminalized adultery and homosexuality for the general public. But inside the Army, our source says it's a different world. Adultery can get you court-martialed under a charge called stealing the affection of a brother officer's wife, and being homosexual can get you kicked out. So soldiers are being held to this completely different and way stricter moral and legal standard than the very society they're supposed to be protecting.
Okay, so after all that, what's the big picture here? We've busted some myths about power, about freedom, and about legal protection. And what we're left with is a picture of a soldier who's fighting on way more fronts than we ever see. Many of these battles are completely invisible to the outside world.
And this really is the heart of it, from our source's perspective. The modern soldier is fighting these unseen wars. It's a war against an internal culture that can be outdated, a struggle inside a legal system that gives them fewer rights and tougher punishments, and a constant battle against a public that sees them as either a perfect hero or a powerful brute, with very little room for the actual human being in the middle. These wars aren't fought with guns. They're fought with paperwork, with pay cuts, and with a whole lot of psychological pressure. So all of this leaves us with one last really important question to think about. We all say it, right? We support our troops. But what does that support actually mean? Is it enough to just wave a flag on a national holiday? Or does real, genuine support demand more from us? Does it require us to look past the crisp uniform to understand the deep, systemic problems they face? And maybe, just maybe, to start asking the hard questions about fixing the very system they've sworn to serve?